Well, thanks very much for having me here. It's a great honor to be meeting you, and I look forward to meeting you when there's more of you again. So why don't I go and get started? I'm going to do this talk in 3 parts, because I think really a lot of the concern is about the jobs, right? Artificial intelligence and jobs. So when we think about what is it that we're afraid of when we're worried about AI, part of it is, will we be able to find a place for ourselves? Then I'm going to talk in a little bit larger frame and talk about intelligence and ethics, and of course survival, as promised in some of the tweets I saw about this. And then finally I'll make a few recommendations. So, can AI replace people? You might think the answer is obvious because we've seen jobs be taken, but well, I want to give you a really great case. So just a few months ago, I was asked to speak in Norway at the Norwegian Radiologists' annual conference keynote. I mean, who knew that there was an annual meeting of Norwegian radiologists? But there are, and I knew why they invited me. So let's have a look at this. It's actually more animated than I usually do. Yeah, there was an elephant in the room, and here it is.
So, Jeff, perhaps a similar question, if you may. What do you think is some of the exciting work to come?
Okay, so, sorry. Let me start by just saying a few things that seem obvious. I think if you work as a radiologist, you're like the coyote that's already over the edge of the cliff, but hasn't yet looked down, so doesn't realize there's no ground underneath him. People should stop training radiologists now. It's just completely obvious that within 5 years, deep learning is going to do better than radiologists, because it's going to be able to get a lot more experience. It might be 10 years, but we've got plenty of radiologists already.
All right, yeah, so 4 years ago, Jeff Hinton said there was no reason to train any more radiologists ever, because we knew that within 5 years, maybe 10, that they would all have their jobs taken. In fact, there's more radiologists now than there were 4 years ago. And the reason is because they actually each produce more value. They're all using AI. And I was slightly wrong. Part of the reason they had me there was not because they were terrified of Jeff Hinton, but rather because they were all using AI and they thought it was cool and they wanted to know about this ethics part of it. So in fact, AI has increased the value of radiologists. He was right that I was going to start out with a couple of very quick definitions because it's only a half-hour talk. I'm going to use a definition of, there's many definitions, but this is one that goes back more than a century, and it's the one I was taught when I was undergraduate learning behavioral science at the University of Chicago. So intelligence is the capacity to do the right thing at right time. And you can think of that also as a form of computation, because what you're doing is you're taking this information. Right now I'm sort of ignoring that information over there or this information back there, but I'm taking this information here and trying to generate the correct action, even though this is actually quite an unusual situation, right? That's what intelligence is about. Now, you might think, oh, there's more to intelligence, it's about, souls or life or, something else. But I think by using this great straightforward definition that was originally invented so that we could talk about which animals were more intelligent than each other, then we can start asking interesting questions like, what is it about intelligence that enhances human value? Or, so to take these pieces apart. All right, so that's the definition I'll use for the whole talk about intelligence. Then what is artificial intelligence is really easy. Artificial intelligence is intelligence in an artifact. Surprise. What is an artifact? It's something that's been deliberately built, okay? So it is not something that scientists discovered under a rock or that came from space or something. It is the subset of all the stuff that translates perception to action that humans are responsible for producing, okay? We're the ones who did it. All right, so let's go back to talking about employment again. Let's pretend that I do actually write programs occasionally still. I wrote some software that made teachers twice as good, all right? What would that mean for employment? Well, actually, there's nothing in that sentence that tells us about employment. Okay, we could either have twice as good of schools, right? The kids get twice as good of education, or we could have half as many teachers. So there's nothing in the software itself that determines that, right? This is a political decision or a normative decision. It's something where we need to choose what we think is important to do. But there are big differences, right? If you choose to go with fewer teachers, then you have fewer people with jobs, right? But maybe you have a higher average quality of teachers. So when people first invented PCs, the Microsoft or whoever, got the PCs down cheap enough that they cost like a half-year salary for a secretary, then people started buying one PC and firing 2/3 of their secretaries and keeping the best secretary because that person could now do much more work because of all the software helping them do more of their job. But those people didn't all necessarily get unemployed that were fired. They went and worked other places, probably for a little less money. So the question here is, we may have a higher average quality teachers, or, and this is not an exclusive or, it could be both, we may wind up with fewer whistleblowers. This isn't such a good example from teaching, although there is some whistleblowing going on right now in UK teaching. But just thinking of it as having a stripped-down organization that gives you a simpler control or management problem. So some people say that they want to do that. Of course, some people say they want to save money. But when you make those sorts of decisions, then you may also wind up with much less diversity. Now, of course, if you're careful about who you chose, you might wind up with still having a similar level of diversity. And then the other thing I talk about often, but I won't talk in depth here about, is fragility. So fragility is when the organization can't handle as many challenges as it could before, right? And in particular, a particular kind of fragility that bothers me, which isn't on the slides, but I'll go into it anyway, is when you have a rigidness because you've computerized and you've created the only interface to the organization through a computer form. So if you have humans that can talk to other humans, then you can solve problems. But if you have your customers only working on a computer form, or if you hire some people to type in the computer form for your customers, but you still take away the liberty of humans solving problems together, that's a kind of fragility too. You find that you can't solve a problem that the customer has. All right. So that was the perspective of the management or the society that's trying to decide how much to invest in education or whatever. Let's look at the other side. So one of the things that people have said for a while is that when you have communication technology, and this is so true of the moment, where you work becomes less determined, right? And so the ways by which unions used to organize is challenged by this precarious nature of jobs, by the fact that you could have, I know that I'm looking at translators right now, I know that the translating industry has massively changed recently, and it's less likely that a translator is working for a single organization, more likely that they're freelance. So this is something that makes it harder to do traditional unionization tactics. I think that this should be fixable because, after all, it is communication technology. So I think we will find ways to organize our societies again. And it does seem that we are already starting to see that in some kinds of platform work, that we are seeing strikes and things like that. However, of course, they are exposed to a level of surveillance that maybe wasn't experienced before, or maybe it was in factories. Okay. It's certainly true, it's amazing to come to Germany and see the ways in which labor is integrated all the way through the organization to the executive. And also in the United States, in some states, where the workers' rights are being supported, it depends on the state, on the legislature. So this is, again, something that is not entirely about just the workers and their union. It is also about the wider society and how the laws have been written to support and to integrate. Okay, let's talk about wages. I think this is the thing that is really the place where the coyote is over the edge of the cliff. because sometimes wages change slowly, even though the real thing that changed them was a while ago. Now, David Otter, I went back, I was talking about those secretaries who lost their jobs when we got PCs. David Otter in 2015 wrote a fantastic paper, which I still recommend, called "Why Are There Still So Many Jobs?" And he pointed out, among other things, that we have more artificial intelligence than ever, and we also have more jobs than ever, right? So it's not a simple relationship, or at least not a simple bad relationship. But there's something else that could be happening that's a problem, and that is it may be that AI is increasing inequality. And part of that is because it may be making it harder to have a range of possible wages, all right? And that is believed, although this is a tricky part of economics, that is believed to be part of the problem with inequality and also with polarization if you don't have social mobility, if you don't have like a smooth level of wages. I'll go into an example really soon. In fact, I'll do the examples. So let's take this one. One of the things that Otter documented, in fact, with colleagues at Boston University, was that there's actually more bank tellers now than there were before automated teller machines, Geldenautomat, right? So that's contrary to people's intuitions. And in fact, if you look at a particular bank branch, there will be far fewer tellers than there used to be in the bank branches. But the consequence of that was it made the bank branches cheaper. And so they were able to have more bank branches, which the customers wanted. There was demand for closer bank branches that took less time to get to them. And so you wound up with many more branches and actually more tellers making slightly more money because they weren't doing the easy jobs anymore. They weren't just counting money very often, right? However, that wasn't the only reason it was cheaper. It was also because of that smaller number of people, you didn't need so many bank managers. And they were the ones that were really bringing in the money, right? Now, you could say, well, who needed those guys? They were guys. They were mostly white males, yes, and at least in North America. And I actually learned this from the Royal Bank of Scotland, so I guess in Scotland. But they were probably one of the more talented people in the organization. They were reasonably able to work with people. And there was always someone in the community that had worked their way up to that then if something disastrous happened, like a tree fell on the school, might be able to be the philanthropist to come in and chip in. So there was someone around with a little more money. So that might be something that's essential to the economy. Another example, people worry that driverless cars will take all the driving jobs. But in fact, right now, there aren't enough people. It's hard to It's hard to hire truck drivers. Almost all the truck drivers in the United States, at least, are old and want to retire, and nobody wants to replace them. So you might think that means, well, we need driverless, but I would argue that we're already in the situation that AI has taken over driving. Not entirely, it's not completely driverless, but remember that definition I gave of intelligence a few slides ago, right? Power steering is already translating the situation into action. It used to be in the 1950s and 1960s that a truck driver had to be a physically strong person, right? And they also had to be good with maps, and they also had to be good at bookkeeping, and they had to be organized. Now, it's not trivial to drive now, but it's not as hard as all those things. So more people can become professional drivers more quickly. And the consequence is that they get paid less, and therefore you can't find enough drivers, right? They're being paid half as much as they were in the 1970s. Right. Okay. Let's talk a little bit more about that fewer people with jobs thing. I find it weird I have to make this argument. Maybe, again, I don't in Germany. But in some contexts, I have been in contexts where people were saying, get rid of the people, you can't rely on the people, they're dangerous. All right? Okay, it was one of the very few times I've spoken in Washington, D.C., but anyway. So one reason you want people is diversity. And I'm not just because it's politically correct, because it's useful. All right? There's something called Fisher's fundamental theorem of natural selection. But this isn't just about biology. Machine learning also works a lot the same way as evolution works, right? And evolution goes faster the more variation you have. Okay? It's proportional, right? Why? Because you're, the natural selection, you're selecting the fittest. Well, you need a variety. And if the world changes, you need to be able to grab some variety. All right? So, and we've seen this also. Various people have gone out and looked at, diversity on boards and things like this, and found again, as you increase diversity, you get better performance from a board, a corporate board, right? You just have more ideas. So less variation means less robustness for addressing underlying change, as I said before. So that's one reason you want a bunch of people around who think differently from each other. And the little politically correct, we need privacy, tolerance, and diversity, right? We also need to make sure that people can say what they're thinking and stick out, as well as be different. Otherwise, there's no point. Okay, what about accountability? This is something that people don't think about as much. So they think that, why don't we make the robot responsible for itself? Why don't we make the robot pay tax? Why don't we make the robot a legal person, right? But the problem is that the way we've set up justice, which makes sense for us, is that actually it's more about dissuasion than recompense. That means you're trying to make people do the right thing. You're trying to find ways for society to work together. You're not trying to get something back, some kind of restitution when somebody's done the wrong thing. When people do the wrong things, you're already losing, okay? All of the ways that we try to dissuade people from doing the wrong things are based on what it's like to be a human. Like losing time out of your life because you're in jail, losing social status, losing wealth, so losing liberty, right? And you could say, well, we'll make the robot care about that, right? But the extent to which humans care about those things, it's systemic. And it's not just us. It's like dogs and guppies and sheep. If you separate a sheep from its flock, it's terrified. If you separate a guppy from its school, it can die of stress. This is systemic, and it's because biology knows that we are social animals that need to have this kind of status, and so we're driven to it. We're not going to build that kind of systemic level of aversion into a well-designed artifact. Remember the A part of AI? Right? Now, if you could magically upload a human brain, then yes, you would have something that suffers. But we can talk about that in Q&A. I cut those slides out of here. But any system that we buy is built and designed, and if it's safe and secure and something that people are willing to have liability for, then it's also modular. And so if you put the suffering in, you could take the suffering back out. Or a hacker could take the suffering back out. So it's not going to work the same way people work. And we can already see this when we make certain kinds of artifacts, the corporations. When you go too far in limiting the liability, so there's perfectly good reasons why we have limited liability and why we have legal personality for corporations. But since the 1990s or so, it's been overextended, and we've seen this thing with shell companies. Basically, they're set up only to fail because nobody is invested in seeing the thing work. They're only finding it as a means to do money laundering and to evade accountability. So AI, as a legal person, would be the ultimate shell company. Nobody would care if it would fail, and so it would be set up to fail. It's just asking for corruption. Okay, and if you want to read more about this, we had a paper in 2017 about this with a couple of colleagues that, unlike me, are law profs. I am not a law professor. All right, so that was about AI and jobs. Let's go a little further into these things now. So going back to the definitions, I already said this about intelligence. And yeah, this important thing. It isn't math. You can do computation as a part of the process of math, but my point is that it's not an abstraction. It's not something that's perfect and eternal. It's actually something physical that has consequences, right? Being able to act requires physicality. Computation takes time, space, and energy. People often forget this. That's why you go out and buy a new computer with more memory. That's the space where the computing is being done, right? So some people think, well, that's not what I was talking about when I was worried about AI. I was worried about agents. And again, there's lots of definitions of agent. If you're talking to Donald Davidson, I think he's dead, but if you're reading Donald Davidson, then yes, okay, that's what you care about. But there's another simpler definition of agent, which is, we learn, even in chemistry, you have an agent is something that changes the world. And I agree with you, a robot changes the world. A mobile phone is a kind of robot. It's an AI device that changes the world. It buzzes at you when you're late, right? Something like that. Okay. What we actually are caring about is moral agency. I don't know what the word for that is in German. But moral agents it's a philosophical, technical term that is who is responsible for their actions, right? And it's determined by a society. You might think we all agree about this, but different societies have different ideas about how old you have to be an adult. Some societies, it isn't about how old you are, it's about whether your father is still alive and what gender you have, right? These are the kinds of things that make you an adult, a moral agent in some societies. We can't even agree about how old you have to be to consent to sex, how old you have to be to fight in a war. There isn't universal agreement about these things, right? Moral patiency is the other thing we really care about. What are we obliged to take care of, all right? And these two things brought together are called moral subjects. I'll skip over that. We mostly care right now about agency and patiency. And the question is, are we obliged to put AI into one of those positions, all right? Well, all of those things are just definitions. You can find them in dictionaries. You can find other ones too, but that's coherent. This is the thing I say that drives some people up the wall. I would argue that there's nothing more fundamental to ethics than who are your moral agents and who are your moral patients. And since I've already demonstrated that people have different ideas about who's a moral agent, who's a moral patient, that implies ethics itself is also created by a society. In fact, I would say that the reason you have ethics is it's almost identical with the creation of a society, the sustaining of a society, right? It's the definition of a society. And one of the nice things about that is that it explains why so many of the things that we consider to be ethical, I mean, some of them are clearly involve things about, universal things like theft and murder and things like that. But some of them have to do with what we wear, right? What clothes we wear and in what circumstances, right? But defining your identity, having ways to define your identity and signal it with your music and your culture and your language is one of the things that sustains a society. And so there is a moral component if you want to keep your society together, right? All those things matter, all right? All right. And so, yeah, I think I'm going a bit slow. There's no clock back there either. All right, and I already mentioned this, so I'll keep going. Right. So the concepts like responsibility and intention are things that allow us to co-construct who we are. All right? These, again, are not things that science discovered. They're ways that we think about how we relate to each other. Right? So the humanities discovered it. They're useful concepts. I'm not saying that they weren't discoveries, but it's not something you go out and do an experiment about. Okay? So government enforcements are public goods, right? This set of responsibilities, this idea of what we do it, and how we enforce these things are all forms of public good. And this is a little tag I add in case there's anybody in industry right now. This is why we pay tax, right? Or we should be paying tax. We need to find ways to help make sure that the system is working and it's stable, all right? And that includes giving up some revenue to invest in infrastructure, all right? All right, so I'm going to go into now a little bit about how intelligence is changing the world and come into the security and power things. If you believe, and that's kind of different from what I said earlier, The intelligence is something you can take apart, all right? So that there's action, there's perception, there's motivation, there's memory, there's learning and reasoning, right? If you could take all those pieces, and if you get a big textbook on AI, it'll have those on different chapters, right? Then I would argue that every machine has, and especially writing, can be thought of as examples of AI. They're all ways that we have used artifacts to drive action in an enhanced way from our own motivations, okay? So by this definition, there's been something like 12,000 years of AI. Writing is 10, 12,000 years ago. So you might have heard of this problem, the intelligence explosion or superintelligence, right? There's a concern, actually I.J. Good said this was great. It was the final invention because machines will then invent themselves and we can just stay home and drink or something, I don't know. Whatever we're doing now, right? But anyway, Nick Bostrom made it sound like a bad thing when he wrote superintelligence. So there's this concern that if you have the machines that learn how to learn, there'll be an exponential increase in their capacities, right? And that's one of the ways. And now we can all read exponential curves, right? So I made this argument that we have AI. My argument is that we, with AI, are the intelligence explosion. And here's my exponential curve. So there's an exponential y-axis, and it's still going up exponentially, right? Except for the occasional plague, right? So this is amazing, that 10,000 years ago, there were more macaques. The monkeys were doing better. They evolved more recently than there were hominids. So one of the things that Bostrom said when he said that this is going to be really scary is that there will be unintended consequences. So even if we design the AI really well and we know what its goals are, then, and it's trying to do the goal that we thought it was doing, because we're letting it think for itself, weird side effects might happen. Like a planet might be turned into paper clips just because we asked the machine, the AI system, to organize a few offices, okay? So one of the, where are the unanticipated consequences? Well, I would argue that that increase in the number of humans has been accompanied by a decrease in the number of every other large animal, okay? And there's lots of documentation of this, including more recent papers, but this one has the prettiest graphs. And you can see as humans got to the different continents, there was these big drops. Interestingly, there's actually more biomass now than there used to be, but it's almost entirely things we eat and play with, in terms of large mammals at least. And if you have trouble thinking about exponential graphs, here's the XKCD version from some years ago. And I think this is terrifying. Right? So the dark gray in the middle is all the land mammals that are humans. And then the lighter gray is all the stuff we eat or play with. Right? And the green is all the wild animals left. And there's a lot less elephants now than when this was drawn. Right? The data, I think, was taken from the knots. All right. So I would argue that one of the unanticipated consequences is a challenge on our sustainability. And another one is inequality. Right? That these are things that we didn't really mean to have happen as a consequence of us doing well, but they are, right? Let's talk a little bit more about inequality. So this is a graph from one of my collaborators and some of his collaborators, but the one I'm working with is Nolan McCarty, and it shows, I'm sorry this is American data, but we do have a lot of this in other countries too. It shows that the level of political polarization, which we're all worried about right now, is correlated with inequality. And the level of inequality, let's see if I remember, the dark line is the inequality. The dark line shows what percentage of wealth, of income, is going to the top 1% of earners. And so that was extremely high before World War I, right? Complete entropy then. And then it went down, and then it came back up again. All right. So why was it so high? And if I went into more graphs, I could show more graphs. It was coming up at that point. What was bringing it up in the late 19th century? Well, we're not sure. This is work in progress, and I'll show you some more of it soon. But we think it might be that when you introduce a new technology that reduces the cost of distance, then you naturally get fewer winners. And those fewer winners get all the money, right? So if we were going to go out to the pub, which we can't do and there's hardly any of us, then we wouldn't go to the best pub in Berlin, and certainly not the best pub in the world. We'll go to a pretty good pub that's nearby, right? But if all of a sudden everybody can send their beer on bicycles all over Berlin, it may be that fewer pubs are going to win, right? And so then you have fewer pubs getting more money, all right? So people have been going around in the talk show circuits talking about the Great Decoupling in 1978. What happened when wages plateaued, but productivity kept going up? And what I love about this graph is it shows that there wasn't a great decoupling, or there sort of was. That angle where the inequality starts going up again. But there was a great coupling. And this is the United States, so what happened was after one world war and one financial crash, enough of the elite signed up with the proletariat that FDR was able to bring in the New Deal. And then that brought down, first they brought down political, so you can see the political polarization of the Congress was brought down first, and then they were able to bring down the inequality. The rest of the world all got to that point in 1945, and they signed up to the Bretton Woods Agreement. And they said, okay, we can't allow this kind of mayhem to happen. What happened after World War I did not work right. We need to make sure that we don't have transnational wealth extraction, for example. That's something that causes lots of inequality. And so that was banned for a few decades. Unfortunately, it's been re-innovated. So as I mentioned, if we're going to solve these problems, we need not only that most people notice there's a problem, but some powerful people as well. Not everybody has to realize it, but enough that we can get a coalition together and fix things. I'm going to skip over that part right now. All right, so why would this be? We know that there's a correlation, but we don't know why. I'm doing this is not peer-reviewed yet, or I should say, yeah, no, it's not even peer-reviewed yet. But anyway, we have a mathematical model trying to understand this correlation, and we make a couple assumptions. One is that, as I said before, when you have diversity, you have a higher expected outcome, right? So you know that diversity is a positive thing, and you're more likely to do well. But, and now this is the thing we're adding in that hasn't been done before, we're also assuming that with more diversity, you don't know what's going to happen. So even if the expected outcome is higher, the variation in the outcome is wider. So you might do really well, or you might do really badly. Whereas if you cooperate only with people like you, then you have a better idea of what the outcome is going to be, even though it's a lower outcome. And so what happens then is that if the economy is doing badly, if things are going badly for you, and you don't have enough wealth, and you can't keep your family together, then you reduce the amount of risk you're willing to take, even though you're lowering your own expected outcome. So there's this cycle, this declining cycle. And the figure here, I don't know how clear it is. We started the model out with sort of a 50-50, so that the y-axis here is what is the probability of success when you work with the out-group. That we're assuming it always works with the in-group. And then what you're seeing is that when there's a decline in the quality of the environment, so when you're less likely to be able to support yourself if something goes terribly wrong, then you get this conservative push towards only interacting with the in-group. So we're calling that polarization. The interesting thing is that if the environment gets really bad, then you know that just working with other people like yourself is not going to be enough, and so you gamble for redemption. And then you do get this re-collaboration again at the end. Anyway, you can go read this on arXiv and see if you think it's right. Hopefully we'll get it into a journal at some point. So I want to say that these problems of sustainability and inequality do not only happen to humans. And it doesn't actually only happen to apes, but again, this is my short version, and I love the picture of the apes. But all species have these kinds of problems. And even, Jane Goodall, it was this huge thing when she first documented chimpanzees having a war, and everybody thought, no, it's something about humans. It's like, no, unfortunately not. So the chimpanzees could be living together for a long time. They're successful, they split up, and then they fight, and one troop wipes out the other. And this has now been documented by lots of people. And it's explained when, there's not enough resources. That's when the chimpanzees start attacking the other chimpanzees when they don't have enough food for their own troop. But what about people? People don't only split into two groups, and I think this is what's really interesting about us. So let's say these are not gendered, incidentally. There's no secondary sexual characteristics drawn here. Okay, so if you're lucky, we all have parents. Okay, so hopefully you have a family. You certainly have neighbors. You may not have noticed them much. So you have neighbors. If you're lucky, you get to hang out with them. You hopefully have coworkers. And you may have other people that you hang out with too, right? So human identity is more complicated than chimpanzee identity, and there's a lot of different ways that we can take these things apart. And I think part of what's going on, in fact, one of the things people argue is that political polarization is the wrong name. You should be thinking about identity politics, people choosing or picking an identity and saying that, my religion or my ethnicity or the length of my last name or something is what matters. It may actually be a survival strategy that we had for dealing with hard times, unfortunately, by fighting and going for the resources when we felt like there weren't enough resources. So this is like the opposite of public goods, right? If you can, you want to build up public goods and allow more people to survive. But if you don't see a way to do that, then you start competing and you pick a team. So that's the basic idea. All right, so what should we do now? Hopefully, of course, we're going to be producing public goods and making it so that we can all get through this to the other side. And not just this, all kinds of thises. There's a lot of crises going on right now. There's a lot of focus, of course, understandably, on the pandemic. But don't forget about the assaults on democracy and, of course, the climate crisis. We can't forget about these things that are making it very hard to do what we do. Society is richer than it's ever been before, right? There was a prediction in the early 20th century that people would only work sort of 15 weeks a year or something by the year 2000. And actually, if we wanted to live like the average person lived in 1920, we wouldn't have to work more than a couple of months, right? But nobody's happy with that anymore. We like, air conditioning and, maybe not in Berlin. Sorry. Computers. Computer games, televisions, health insurance. Again, you don't have to pay for that here. Okay, so one suggestion that people have made is that we redistribute all that wealth through something like basic income. And one concern some of us, and I'm one of these people, has is that if we just do that, then we lose some of those links I was showing, those interacting links. We lose there's been Hannah Arendt, a lot of people have talked about the value to yourself that you feel when you have a trade or that people value. But I think that, again, that value to yourself is really the recognition of your value to others. That if you have wealth, you want to employ people. If you have a skill, you want people to employ you. And you can do both, of course. And so it's one of the things that creates a fabric. Now, of course, there may be other things that create the fabric, like the localization, but we've been able to ignore a lot of those other things. Now, so Guy Standing is one of the people who's argued strongly for basic income, and he managed to find funding, and other people found funding, and they've done some experiments, and they've shown that communities that got basic income, it really did bring those communities together. And I think you have to take that seriously. On the other hand, when it is only one sub-community, you have to realize, of course, that gives the community an identity. So it's not surprising that might bring them together. And there's also the concern about the longer-term consequences and the the curves we saw, like after socialism would come through, entitlement. So although doing well for a generation is always a good thing too. The other big concern is that people aren't seeing that we already are getting a massive basic income, right? We have all these nice things, not just the theaters, but also the streets and the personal security and that you can walk around without a sword, as Hobbes said. You would never leave the house without a sword, would you? Right? So we no longer walk around with swords, and we have nice roads, and we have people to collect our garbage, and we have water that comes into our house. All of these things are being provided as a basic income already, but they are differentiated. Some people get more help than others. Some people really cannot get through life in contemporary society without additional help. And so that is another problem with this model. So let's talk a little bit about government. What is government for? Again, in the tech industry, a lot of people are not sure. but I was fortunate to hear this guy, Landau. I probably say his name wrong. He's French. In fact, apparently when the EU was like 7 guys in a room, he was the French guy. So anyway, he defined it this way. Look, the first thing government does is pick problems to solve. The second thing is allocate resources to solve that problem. And then the third thing is stabilize that solution. And he was very concerned that that was the thing that was getting disrupted after the 2008. Both corporations and countries have governments, right? There's a lot of discussion with AI about self-regulation. Yes, absolutely, regulate yourself. But we have governments to coordinate all those other infrastructure things that we've forgotten about, that we ignore the streets and the health insurance and things like that. So we want governments to help us police our sectors, and we want our corporations to help us police our governments, right? We want to try to combat corruption in every way we can, right? It's a cooperative effort. And if every aspect of good governance makes these interactions easier. Okay, so what I told the Norwegian radiologists at this point was, hey, you guys don't have a problem. Norway has at least historically been the go-to example of how not to experience a resource curse, how not to get that huge amount of inequality, right? So when they found oil, they said the government's going to invest this and it's going to benefit all the people, right? So wealth is distributed, it's not captured by an elite, at least historically, right? And I'll show you some statistics really quickly. Where you have high inequality, this is again slightly confusing, the x-axis, high inequality, is far out, and the y-axis is about how much health and social problems you have. And again, this is 2011. I think you would find UK way up on health and inequality right now. But anyway, yeah, here's Norway. And there's America. And here's Germany. It's doing pretty well. So inequality was increasing. I didn't mention this, but actually you don't want it to be zero. Economies don't seem very strong when everybody has exactly the same thing. We do seem to like to have some kind of motivational pressure, or, as I mentioned before, the people who do a little better having more assets so that they can help other people. I don't speak Norwegian, but apparently the blue line is the number of people in Norway that think they pay too much tax, right? So they're happy with the arrangements, being a high tax, low inequality society. In contrast, my adopted country, in the 15 years running up to last year, has just had absolute plummeting of inequality, and London we just kind of missed it. I saw weird things happening, but it's hard to put all the pieces together. I lived in the Southwest, and a few towns like Bath and, I think it's called Truro. There's a couple things that were super shiny, and all the hipster stuff was coming there, but lots of towns were just collapsing. And again, this is about assortment, that we have the power to all the people with money go to the pretty places, and they leave a bunch of places behind, right? So anyway, just the hunger, the people not, I have a friend in Wales that says that they don't even keep the schools open. Of course, again, right now, nobody has their schools open. But they were having trouble keeping their schools open 5 days a week. They were cutting back to 4 and even 3.5 days a week on the schools in the rural parts of the country. So this is the real tragedy of Brexit. And the interesting thing is it's not regulatory capture by oil, but apparently by the financial sector. But it still has the same kind of consequences that if all the rules are set up so that you don't have taxes to pay, then you can't take care of people adequately. All right. So what should we do? I think I sort of hinted at where I'm going to go. I've only got 2 more slides. I'm probably going too slow. I'm sorry. It's a weird audience. All right. So AI will make us, many of us at least, better at doing our jobs, just like the Norwegians. It already is. This is like, why am I talking about the future? We've been doing this since the 90s. I can spell now. I didn't used to be able to spell, right? So we're all getting better at doing our jobs. That could mean that there will be lower entry barriers to doing a job, and that can result in lower salaries, all right? So whether the benefits from these kinds of things get distributed isn't anything to do with AI, it's about governance. And that's why I went to a governance school, because I realized if I'm talking about AI ethics all the time, that's where I'm going to actually find out how to solve the problems. Successful governments right now fall under huge propaganda attacks, and that's why I still think the crisis of democracy and governance is one of the biggest ones that we're dealing with right now, because without effective governments, it's hard to solve the other problems. I don't even need to name the countries. Okay, so yeah, I'm just setting up as a hypothesis that some powers don't like the tobacco regulation or money laundering regulation or the strength of NATO or the EU. And maybe they don't like the assault against climate change, that we have this almost global agreement that we should do something about climate change. Have you seen this graph before? Do you know what this is? You're such a small audience, no one's going to volunteer anything. They're all just sitting back there. All right, I'll tell you what it is. It's the expected change of GDP as a consequence of global warming. All right, so so when you have policies, when you are pushing through policies that are going to increase global warming, accelerate climate change, who's benefiting? Right. So that review is in the technology review from a couple of years ago, but this line is not. This is a separate thing. One definition of war is dismantling your enemy's infrastructure such that they lose autonomy with respect to you. That is, that you get to have your way, they don't get to have their way. And I wouldn't be surprised if 100 years from now or 150 years from now, people treat this period right now as a war that's already going on, because we are doing these kinds of assaults. So, last slide. AI is not magic, right? It's something that people make, and it's something that we change things with. We author AI, and we author the laws that govern it, okay? And we author the laws that govern our economy. Humanity and society cannot be replaced easily. Remember that one slide about dissuasion and justice? It goes beyond that, right? It's aesthetics. What does it even mean to, how can we have machines value the things we value? Everything comes down to a bunch of apes trying to survive on the planet, everything that humans care about. So it's not sensible to think about machines replacing us in those endeavors, all right? Employment may not only be about meeting basic needs, right? And again, as is well established, nor only about specialization and redistribution, although that's important too, but also about generating social connections, diversity, and broad security. And although I expressed skepticism about universal basic income, I do think there's real work that needs to be done about thinking more about how we share wealth through the system, given how the system provides the materials that produce the AI and other kinds of technologies that are benefiting so many people, or so few people, so much. All right. And then finally, this is an implication, I would recommend that technology, including the law, should be used to increase transparency and accountability, not confuse those. Because that's the way we'll be able to get on top of this problem and convince people to come on top of the problem. So we really need to be working more on helping people understand the system. All right, so thank you for your attention.